Chapter 6. Macelyn Mornroe, Queen of Malkinor, exhibited an outward calm facade. In the past 2 years, she forced herself to master her emotions on an entirely new level. The growing relentlessness and itching of paranoia gnawed on her mind incessantly, increasing over time. She had much to fear, and even more reason to display calm. She stood at a tall, east-facing window of her sitting den, overlooking the gardens and walkways from high above. The trees and flowers were browning with the coming of autumn. The foliage littered the cobbles and growing grasses. The pensive irritation seized Macelyn by every nerve ending. For the last 2 years, she could do nothing. Her forces, allies, and underground market were at a complete halt. But the Kassaran invasion granted the Order a new way to view anything they wished. It was only because the war was so all-encompassing that Torch Ryland didn't shift his attention to Macelyn. If he did, he would begin an inevitable dig through all the skirmishes before the war, only to find her at the helm of it. The thugs besieging the outlying baronies before the invasion were employed by Marquis Majan Torfan, trained by his guards, and paid for by money from Macelyn's slave and arm trades. They were mediocre in their combat skills, nowhere near the capability of her Kassaran-trained forces. But intimidation and high pay were enough to buy their loyalty and discretion. After watching a debilitated Torch Ryland pick apart the hostage seize of Borquet with an impossible degree of espionage, Macelyn ground her teeth in anger. The Crimson Empire's placement of forces at Borquet left only the certainty of their victory, but the Chronomancer's abilities allowed him to view past events with any level of scrutiny he desired. He could possess hours of soldiers' briefings in minutes. By the blessing of fate, everyone forgot about the hired thugs or their suspicions in the chaos of the war. Macelyn capitalized on this and remained quiet. Macelyn's steel blue eyes shifted to the light gray blanket of clouds above. Her rose-red lips pursed in a slight, unrevealing frown. Her plans now hinged on the success of 2 young women, not unlike her. At least one was a calculating survivor, and she was clever enough to keep her raving sister on a metaphorical short leash. This gamble was unlike Macelyn. All her previous plans and victories relied on her own cunning to see her through. But a circumstance such as this called for something extra. Cassian was resourceful enough to deflect the attention of Elysian for years. His ability to read into people's thoughts was flawless. That she managed to harness his ignorance at all was surprising enough. In a further stroke of luck that could not be called coincidence, the Order believed the Bloodskate twins were killed in the day that led to the eclipse. Macelyn needed no more omens to know that she should utilize their powers of redirecting attention. If they could find a way to move about the 6 nations and use their magic without alerting the Order, then she believed they would somehow be the key to the Queen's progress. A knock sounded at the door to her sitting den. She turned from the window. Her long, thick braids swung from under the weight of her diamond tiara. The satin folds of her cream-colored sleeveless gown swirled with the motion. "You may enter and kneel," Macelyn declared. Macelyn's son Amorlik entered. As Macelyn seated herself on a silver silk armchair, he knelt with her head bowed before her. This revealed the tail of his long, yellow-blonde hair. Kneeling to his mother was an odd visual custom for many to see. Macelyn insisted so that Amorlik would maintain an outward appearance of humility. It was also so that he would know, always, that the throne was not yet his. It was her way of preventing any more mishaps, as did occur years ago. But it wasn't needed. Macelyn was proud of the cunning survivor that Narranmore forced Amorlik to become. She sent away a child and a brute, a spoiled bully. Narranmore gave her a man, less bulky, tall, and as quick as a serpent. He was now as ambitious as he was intelligent and creative. At Macelyn's wishes, Amorlik no longer donned his long black leather coat, or his straps and belts of poisoned weapons. Now that he returned to the palace, and all of its soft-natured nobles, it was prudent that he did not display the full extent of his now lethal nature. Such a display would garner unwanted attention and raise condemning questions. But she really didn't need to tell him as much. He already knew and acquiesced long before he asked. He held a far better understanding of her expectations than ever. Amorlik now wore a yellow velvet short-sleeved tunic that matched his hair and loose-fitting black trousers. His fists knuckled the ground, flexing the bulge of his forearm muscles beside the shine of his black leather boots. "How was your morning ride?" Mayselin asked, speaking meaningfully in code she reserved for nobles and workers to keep her secrecy. "The air was fair and cool, your majesty," Amorlik answered in a feigned cheer. Mayselin nodded. His meaning was that no one made mention of suspicions. Her assets and activities remained in a quiet standby and were undiscovered yet. This, of course, limited her profits or the ability of Lord Barcells to cleanse their trail of origin. Her remaining compounds were now operating on skeleton crews of chemists, smiths, and guards. The outgoing poison and weapon trades to marauders in the north were much smaller. She could no longer take in slaves or subjects for human experimentation. "It is such a season. We can expect no harsh winds," Mayselin answered patiently. It was a code to say that they should remain still for now. "Yet, I heard of an emerald-crested lark making its nest among the garden heaps of pruned roses." Mayselin's knuckles whitened on the arm of her chair, and she fought the urge to grind her teeth. This code was more specific to Amorlik and herself. She was impressed that he could speak of it so calmly. He was referring to his childhood enemy and his former betrothed. He was indicating word that Torch Ryland would soon arrive in Malkanor. The proximity would further tighten her silence as much as her nerves. "Then the season persists. The cold is terrible for hunting birds," Mayselin advised. "Oh, isn't it delightful how they dance with words?" Intruded the giddy mirth of a young woman. She sounded from the folds of the drapes, but Mayselin didn't want to waste the energy to turn and identify the speaker. She quickly dismissed the giggling observation to obnoxious chatter from irrelevant bystanders. Mayselin briefly thought it was odd that she should think so little of the intrusion. It was equally unnerving that Amorlik also appeared dismissive. But a weighted fugue sensation weighed down on her mind, pressuring it until she resumed her ignorance. "That was close," commented another young woman with a harder edge to her voice. "The boring merchant enchantment might need a little tuning. I don't think it's squeezing the nerve clusters hard enough. Right now, it is enough to evade most forms of detection." Mayselin did not speak further, and she did not know why this was. What relevance was there to inane chatter around her? "Shall we cue the actors that they are on stage?" asked the giddy one. The other didn't answer. It was difficult to put into words what Mayselin felt next. The pressure in the air receded, and her head was eased with a sudden pop inside her skull. Recognition flooded her mind as she turned and gasped, while Amorlik appeared calm, his face paled. "My dears, you've done it!" Mayselin breathed. "It's not perfect yet, but not even Light Ryland would show interest." Cassian beamed proudly. Though the Bloodskate twins wore velvet and silks, and long since discarded their order robes, their time in the northern wastes made them appear plain in a way Mayselin found contradictory to their greatness. She would have to make them look the part of a noblewoman later. At least the insane Larian looked clean and less frazzled than normal. Mayselin gestured to a small pink couch. "Please sit. Tell me more." The twins obeyed, and Amorlik sat in a red armchair at a guarded distance. Cassian reached into a deep pocket at the right of her black velvet shirt. She extracted a small leather book and offered it to Mayselin. Mayselin immediately took to the pages. She recognized the curved and linear symbols on the pages, having hired many skilled Caesarian gladiators and soldiers as instructors, all of whom were missing after the eclipse. She allowed time to learn the Crimson Empire's language to an adequate degree. This book was far too fluent for her to understand all the details, but she thought she had the faint gist of it. I am inclined to believe this is a study from the Enchanters Guild. Maysellin arched a questioning eyebrow at Cassian. Cassian nodded, smiling. A journal from a defector. His mind was slipping, so he had to write instructions for enchantments. He volunteered for some very interesting experiments. Maysellin leaned forward with an undisguised interest, and Cassian's tone became conspiratorial and hushed. I won't bore you with too many scholarly details, Your Majesty, but this journal held the beginnings of what severed us from our magic before the eclipse. I believe my own magic is uniquely suited to understand this study and drive it in a new direction. Maysellin quirked her eyebrow in a higher peaked arc. And what direction might that be? I believe, given time, I can develop a method of giving the ability of sorcery to some, while removing it from others. I believe this can separate your empire from the likes of any other, now or ever before. Maysellin hissed to Cassian. You speak too frankly, too openly. Cassian shook her head. Not in the least, Your Majesty. To even the most skilled of spies, our discussion is as relevant as two peasants discussing bricks. That reminds me. Cassian reached into her skirt once more. Maysellin wondered how many resources the young woman kept so close to her person. She retrieved a small, red-hued iron star and offered it to Maysellin. The queen examined the metal, turning it over with her hand. It was flat, but its edges were dulled smooth. One side had an intricate series of engravings. What is this? Maysellin asked without looking up from her examination. The details are lengthy, Your Majesty, Cassian warned. I have not become Queen of Malkinor by disregarding opportunities to acquire knowledge. Cassian nodded, taking the meaning. The metal is blood iron, extracted from one of the many intruders in the north. I have altered its composition to accomplish two ends. It absorbs and muffles ambient waves of the endless currents. Then, it uses the acquired energy to fuel the spell shapes I have etched into the metal. In this way, it obfuscates our use of sorcery, while rendering our conversations and presence irrelevant to potential eavesdroppers of any kind. It does little good to me, since I cannot wield this endless current. Maysellin countered as she pushed the offering back. Cassian stopped her hands. Her smile broadened. I place emphasis on absorbing ambient endless current. Everything generates it. Naturally, spell shapes only create far more to draw from. This metal functions as a lightning rod for those energies. Maysellin could not fully conceal the slight upward quirk of her deep red lips. It seemed sending the Bloodskate twins into the wastes was the kind of gamble that rewarded her far beyond her hopes. Only one question remained. How many of these charms can you produce? Cassian sat back. That is the glory of the magic of my sister and I, Your Majesty. We can create as many as suits our desire. This news alone was enough to break the standstill on Maysellin's plans. And you're certain your presence is well and truly concealed from the view of the Order? Amorlik added his inquiry with a tightened scowl, as he leaned back with his arms folded. I insisted you return with my two best men when we could all be certain detection was impossible. Maysellin pushed down the desire to shout at her son to stay his suspicion. He made no secret of his distaste for the sorceresses, and often placed a wide proverbial chasm between himself and Larian's affections.
Maysella knew he tolerated them only at her insistence. By the same token, requiring a subtle trial as a method to verify their certainty was not unreasonable. Though Amorlik's long-standing grudges with magic were ever present, he at least understood the need to channel his resentment for greater gains. But Cassian was undaunted by the challenge. They are enjoying a tankard at the tavern on the 2nd Eastern Avenue from the palace gates. Worry not. They do not drink so much to dull their wits. That last seemed an observation of sorcery, and Maysellen felt a giddiness come over her. She reined in it before she spoke. I have many tasks for you two. Rest the day and night, and prepare yourselves.
Chapter 7. The tropical island keys of the uncharted southern archipelago were places of wild vegetation. The towering trees and densely packed thickets were impassable in places, and bristling with barbs coated in rare venom in others. Cassian felt the presence of the poison. She felt it oozing through the pores of the long thorns, clustered in bright berries, and filling the fangs of a variety of spiders and snakes. A unique cacophony echoed across the distance of the jungle, a mix of growls, shrieks, and hoots from animals Cassian had never encountered before. There was a varied sensation to them, and she guessed while some were mating calls, others might be territorial growls of warning. Cassian took one step and was greeted with a familiar clatter against her feet. She looked down, staring past the thick layer of growth. There were dozens of bleached, dry white bones. They belonged to a mix of creatures, but Cassian recognized a human tooth and femur. In a couple of steps, Cassian knew she was not walking into a single pile of discarded remains. The ground was covered in a hidden layer of dead things. Rack and Ben stepped forward ahead of Cassian. Her sister was left at the palace in Palantir, hidden away since there was delicate work to be done. The two men walked in front, strangely soundless, taking a protective lead for her. The mercenaries were very familiar with the island, at home among the hunting predators and dangers too numerous to count. It was just as well. Cassian looked at the layer of death beneath the growth with fascination. She paid close attention to the number of human bones. She was no stranger to Maysellen's varied interests and interactions. She had been a guest at the Narrated compound for weeks before the final Kassaran siege had left it in ruin. The amount and number of resources Maysellen kept at her first hold was formidable enough. Cassian thought the loss of such an investment would have been crippling for the Queen's goals. The loss was not enough to upset or truly slow Maysellen. She had half a dozen other compounds. She owned half the apothecaries and smithies in Western Stratia, and she had 2 major strongholds, each housing and employing 50,000 mercenaries from all over Province. Cassian looked up to watch Rack and Ben for a moment. They evaded carefully concealed tripwires and disarmed hundreds of traps by activating various insidious hidden switches, a rock in the dirt or twigs that appeared to be fresh growth on the trees. As many as there were 5 times as many human pieces everywhere. Sorcery or not, this island was lethal to unsuspecting intruders. Cassian heard that men who proved capable were given the chance for Maysellen's employ here, or were set loose and hunted. It was worlds past at the Narrated compound. The truth was at Cassian's feet. They stopped before a tall tree drooping with leafy vines. Its bark was covered in a thick layer of moss and fungus. Rack stepped forward into a clearing beneath a cloudless sky, and an autumn sun that beamed with heat worthy of summer. He cupped his hands to his mouth. He shook his head while he surprised Cassian with a loud, warbling animal cry. It was the first sound she had ever heard from his mouth. He waited a moment before carefully reaching for a vine and pulling it twice. Cassian saw that the other vines were covered in thorns that glistened with poison. A portion of the forest floor lifted, groaning with the strain of wood. A narrow hole opened with a staircase leading down. There was a series of metal clicks that sounded towards the opening before falling deep below.
When there was silence, Rack and Ben led the way once more. The wooden hatch creaked as it closed over their heads. They descended into the deep, down a narrow stone hallway. Torches extended from the walls, bursting with flickering orange flame as they progressed. The air was filled with a combination of verdant soil and clouds of smoky, burning pitch. Cassian looked at dozens of slits and openings in the stone around her. They were tiny stone trigger plates she recognized from the Narrenmore compound. Some of the openings were an exact size and shape from Morlick's crafted snare design. It was obvious now that Rack's call was partially a secret-coded request to disarm the traps in the stairway and allow them safe passage. Cassian recalled Morlick's severing snares, and the way they cleaved heavily armored soldiers in half. She fought to contain a shudder at the mental image of such an end for herself, if Rack and Ben had been absent. The sounds of clanging metal and shouting men grew in the silence, reaching from deeper in the earth. Dry heat permeated the air with rising discomfort, accompanied by the thick reek of body odor, metal, and blood. When Cassian was surrounded with cloying heat, thick stench, and deafening noise, the stairway ended. They emerged on an unrailed stone balcony, a walkway that circled around and far above a massive chamber that stretched for miles. She looked at the size and scope of the island operation before her and gaped. In the torch and furnace light, it was clear that Maycellum was frighteningly close to seizing any part of the world she wished. Had the Queen so chosen, she might have been able to shove the Kassaran invaders back into the sea. What this force did not hold in numbers back then, they would have made up for with intense training, versatility, and an array of unique weapons and armors. This place revealed why Rack and Ben were such superior fighters. There were hundreds of training rings and platforms, thousands of weapons and armor racks. Tens of thousands of men sparred with each other. Hundreds stood in windowed chambers that spilled bright orange light. The chambers were set in the walls at the ground level, or in tall, wide domes that had long steel pipes extended high above. Within, men hammered at anvils with large hammers. They must have been placed so that any weapon or armor the fighting men needed, or wished repaired, could be done within moments. There were darker entries as well. Cassian thought these might lead to less extensive combat areas. In the deafening commotion, Cassian failed to detect the approach of a tall, leather-clad man on the balcony. He stopped before Rack and Ben, sparing Cassian a perfunctory nod with suspicious dark eyes. Rack and Ben unstrapped their dagger whips and pressed their coiled lengths forward with both hands. The men nodded. They restrapped their weapons and began an exchange of hand signals that could only be called dialogue. The tall man had no trouble watching their signals and responding with his own. Their hands stopped moving. Rack and Ben parted before the tall figure approached Cassian.
It's unusual to see a lady, especially a sorceress. Come here. Her Majesty prefers to entertain her guests elsewhere.
The man's voice was as clipped and as even as his blunt manner of speaking, but Cassian knew this man was veiling his doubts and suspicion for her presence. Cassian reached into her skirt pocket and retrieved a diamond as big as the end of her thumb. The widest gleam facet was etched with a small, noticeable rose made of gold. She passed it to him, and he accepted it, quirking his eyebrow as he examined the glittering stone.
An envoy, then. By the looks of it, the quiet time is nearly over.
Cassian held back the argument that any time would not be quiet here.
Follow me and stay close, my lady.
The tall man turned, leading her along the wall. Rack and Ben assumed loose, statuesque stances and remained behind. Cassian looked all around her appreciatively. Outside of the training grounds, she made out the parallel lines of steel engraved in the stone floor. Large metal carts were pushed with greater ease by pairs of large men. They halted just outside the forges and deposited stacks and containers in a swift, organized precision while crates were loaded back in the carts. Cassian did not want to betray her ignorance, so she kept her questions and astonished observations to herself. But the scope of what she was seeing was beyond her imagining. The stronghold was as much a massive foundry as it was a training ground for soldiers. Maysellin's ambitions were evident at about 3 decades ago, maybe a little more. How did one courtesan build so much so quickly? The magnitude of this stronghold, a place of chiseled stone and steel beneath a deadly island jungle, would take the concentrated efforts of hundreds to fashion in so few years. As Cassian walked behind her host, she realized what set Maysellin apart and above from her fellow highborns and rulers. While they sat in self-indulgence all day, content with their holdings, Maysellin constantly monitored the world around her for assets of the highest value. If she could use it, it was added to her efforts to claim potentially all of Provis. Her empire was on a constant rise, even if she wasn't present to personally witness all of it. The Queen of Malkinor fashioned a perfect engine for continual evolution. The soldier turned to a darkened, narrow hallway that led to a small iron door. Beyond the office was a square Spartan room. 3 metal chairs were situated around an iron table. The room was illuminated by 2 torches that added a cloying heat to the room. The soldier moved to sit down. Cassian sat at a chair closest to the door.
You are new to Her Majesty's inner circle.
The man bluntly observed as he sat back without slouching. Everything about him was concise and disciplined.
I can see it in you. You might have known of her plans, but you were unaware of the size and precision of her operations. You look like you have as many questions as any one of our freshly recruited fighters.
Cassian smiled. If there was time to satisfy my curiosity, she would not have sent me with a personal signet. The soldier raised an eyebrow and his lip twitched in a smirk.
To the orders that brought you, then. Quite right, and pleasantly efficient. So what word from Her Majesty, then?
Cassian's smile broadened as she recited the message. We have seeds to plant, Keeper. We ought not plant too much in haste, lest our efforts become clumsy.
Will the sun not wilt our harvest?
The question was a code as well. There is plenty of shade this day. The keeper leaned forward, his chin resting on his hands as he smiled with interest.
How many? What are we sending them?
We need a strong foundation in Vodus. Have 36 prepared for Meldwalk by dawn. Baron Menjin has already briefed his men on their arrival. As they continued to plan who would return to the mainland, Cassian held back the greatest part of her knowledge. As strong and formidable as these forces were, Cassian believed she could contribute something to their prowess. Cassian needed to return to her sister and resume her research.
Chapter 8.
Torch Maurice walked beside Solus Nerelise along the dusty, broken cobbles of the main thoroughfare. The streets were lined with tightly packed, low adobe buildings and unwashed, cracked walls and red, decaying rooftops. Piles of abandoned refuse permeated the air with a foul, rancid odor, inviting the rats that darted in and out of the shadows. Children ran in the streets while the adults were either concealed or laying in alleyways and open doors in stupors as deep as death. Signs from battered shops and taverns hung broken and worn from above their entries. Many of the doors showed signs of aggressive intrusion. This was Saral, the capital city of Vodus. For 3 generations of kings, it fell deeper in neglect and decay more and more every day. Each ruler fell progressively further into their opium addictions. The other rulers worried how the kings obtained it, why they would, and why their supply chain wasn't located and severed. As Maurice walked by the short, ample Chronomancer, He wondered why the Order did not send a hard liaison much sooner. The air was as thick with potential disease as it was with apathy. This initial visit was only to prepare King Forzan for the Rulers' Summit, which would begin in a couple of days. If the capital city was any indication, Maurice felt growing concern for what they might find of him. Maurice had never visited Votus before. He looked at the clear blue skies and heard the surging waves of the stone city as they crashed to the west. He could imagine the beauty the founders must have intended for it ages ago. The low, dusty hillocks to the east were barren now, but Terrell could attest to the ability of geomancers to restore vitality to the land. He could imagine the trees and whispering emerald grasses in the ocean breeze. Though lower in elevation, with less of the rocky bluffs and precipices, it felt like it would have been like Catan Shah. Not even war had been enough to strip the eastern nation of its scenic grace. Maurice chose to lose his thoughts in the clack of Narralise's bleached yew staff as she walked. The Catani woman kept the hood of her gray robe up, hiding her long red hair. It was the sign that she wished to keep to herself and her thoughts for the moment. He did not fault her for her withdrawal. Maurice accompanied Narralise to learn how the Order would conduct itself for the people and rulers of Stratia. There was little he could learn and practice as an Elumancer, little enough to cause his mentors to scramble for his next lesson. It was time for him to become better acquainted with the duties of a Solus. But Narralise's purpose here were double-pronged. Though the Hydromancers were supposed to make for the best healers, she matched their efforts and surpassed them in her ability with the mind. She demonstrated as much when she aided Light Moral in conquering his night terrors and suppressing his insomnia. The Aeromancer might be the best candidate for lifting the enslaving haze of the King of Votus. So one of her purposes was to render him lucid enough to attend the Ruler's Summit. However, even after that, Narralise was to return to the Palace of Votus, not only to help free his mind forever, but to help him become the king his people desperately needed. It was a monumental task. Votus was a victim of at least a century of its own neglect. Maurice did not pull up the hood of his gray robe. He forced himself to see, to absorb the horrible state of the city around him. His spirit teachers, the past Soluses who died and offered their lives in the magic that sealed the Book of Worms, would insist at this moment. He could not look away from the pains or the wrongs around him. He needed to look, unflinchingly, and confront it. At a four-way junction in the streets, still a considerable distance from the palace, Maurice looked at a boy several years younger than himself. He sat in the shade of a wall of a decrepit house. His lightly tanned face was filthy and clammy. His forehead glistened with fever sweat. His eyes were glazed, and his hair was matted with wet ends. Maurice could do little for his filthy clothes. Food and water would have made the child into a target for his peers. But Maurice could not abide the way his lips quivered with each sighing breath. He opened his palm and projected translucent strands of magic from his hand into the sick boy's body. The boy's health was a perfect reflection of the state of Votus: neglect, starving, and left to die slow. A great deal of sickness was a stomach malady from drinking ocean water to satisfy his thirst. There was a lack of vital elements from malnutrition, and the increased cold of autumn invited a fever from seasonal chill. If unchallenged, his lungs would fill to the point where he would not be able to breathe. His body did not hold enough strength to fight this onslaught on its own. The boy's chest began to glow slightly, while Maurice mouthed quiet words. The glow sought the foreign matter in his lungs and cleansed it in bursts of golden eldritch. Maurice pushed a gentle, cool, cleansing wave of energy to relieve the inflammation and fever. Though the subtle light in the shade was visible, the full effect of the healing would not be noticeable for another quarter of an hour. The magic itself was small and casual so as not to draw too much attention to Maurice. It needed time to settle in the boy's body. Neralise gave Maurice a glance over her shoulder. Her dark blue eyes shone with a hint of approval. Well done, Light Maurice, and very subtle. But you forget to cleanse his belly of its malcontent. Maurice feigned a meek downcast of his eyes and voice. Yes, Light Neralise. I will strive to do better in the future. Neralise nodded and turned her attention ahead. Worry not, Light Maurice. Your skills as a healer will only grow to exceptional heights. You already shape your spells very well for one so young. Thank you, Light Neralise. It was an act, of course. Maurice purposefully left the sickness so that it would appear as inexperienced as any torch of his age. The stomach sickness was slight enough that it would pass on its own. Maurice was learning from the greatest Solus and Ard Solus of the past decade. They found a way to commune with him. He was now the vessel for all their knowledge and experience. They taught him a wide range of spells only they knew. They taught him the secret truth of long-buried histories. Most horribly, Maurice now knew the truth of the Order of the Void Triangle. He knew the secrets Light Rylan kept from all but his wife. Maurice still held out hope for Rylan. No matter that he gave the Void Triangle what they wished for in one day, Rylan was backed into a corner, desperate to save all of Stratia from total genocide. Neralise stopped at a widening in the street. On the other end of a semicircular plaza, there was a rusted iron gate, one side leaning askew on its central hinge. There were no guards, and the adobe wall was only a little higher than 10 feet, cracked with vines protruding everywhere. Neralise turned to Maurice and gave a wincing glance to the inn at the end of the street. It was one of the few buildings with 3 floors. Its windows were broken with rotted planks nailed in place to keep the cold out. A sign creaking as it swayed on a rusted chain did not help to identify the structure well. Maurice had trouble deciphering the faded leathers in brown or the chipped paint blotch. Only combined did he see the establishment was called the Two-Legged Bull. The image was supposed to be a bovine without its 2 front legs in a low nosedive. Neralise breathed a steady sigh. The palace, if it can be called that, is just over there. Neralise hooked a pointed thumb over her shoulder. We will go together, but I suspect I will need to remain with His Majesty in the night. If he is to be presentable, lucid, and understandable for the summit, I want you to see an hour of my work. Then you will depart into the city, alone. Neralise looked up to the sky, taking measure of the time. Until sunset, you will tend to the well-being of the children. When you are done tending their ailments, attempt to locate a source of clean water and safe food. Nudge the children to it, but be subtle. Though Maurice understood what Neralise was trying to accomplish, he queried as an unpracticed torch. Will it not be better to rouse the grown-ups as well? Neralise shook her head. The king and his people must unite to break the chains that weigh them down. The people follow suit for their ruler, so the king must decide first. When the night is done, I will find you here at the Two-Legged Bull. Neralise's mouth twisted in distaste at the name. Maurice knew she was not looking forward to sleeping in any such place. Neralise turned and led the way forward anew, her hand raised as they came to a gate, and a strong, concentrated gale shoved the screaming metal open. She shook her head as they pressed on. It is difficult to believe that someone like Kara could have been born in such squalor. Maurice nodded and maintained a layered silence. The Evoker Solus who instructed Light Isha died bravely defending the children during the destruction of the Zenith Citadel. Thanks to Light Rylan, her last valiant moments were recorded in the new histories of the Order. But Maurice knew those moments almost as well as Rylan. Every spirit in the barrier had been allowed to convey their life and the final moments to it. Kara was born and raised on the streets of Sorol. She was strong-willed, very defiant against the Addict Elders. If she found children who were threatened, she often stood to take their pains for them. Boys and girls who would have been beaten by their mothers and fathers were spared as Kara shouted venomous profanities at them, redirecting their aggressions. Sural, like Malkinor, was a testament of finding exceptional people in the most unlikely of places. Maurice followed Nerylise into what might have been a courtyard. He held a startled breath at the sight of guards laying on the ground. He breathed a sigh of relief when he realized they were alive, just unconscious from overuse. Stone benches were broken in half. Walkways were cracked from long weeds that emerged from the cobbles. Flower beds were dried and marked with weeds and fungus. Lawns were no more than knee-high lengths of yellow crabgrass. The state of neglect continued, changing only with the backdrop, as the two pressed onto the royal bedchamber unchallenged. Nerylise moved with a confident stride and a sense of direction that surprised Maurice. She shoved through the bedchamber double doors with little effort, but with a heavy breath of frustration. Nerylise covered her mouth and nose with a cloth before her muffled voice came.
"Wait here, Light Maurice. I need to assess this personally before I permit you to enter."
Maurice nodded as Nerylise walked into the consuming, tangible gloom. There came the rustling of heavy clutter, and a tiny roll of endless current preluded the break of darkness while a white brilliance of a current sphere. The light shoved a wave of combined foul odors at Maurice. He held his breath and continued to wait. Maurice looked down as he waited. There was a strange powder peppering the top of reeking clutter. It was random, a particle in one place, a small pile in another. Just looking at the bedchamber and hearing the buzzing of flies, Maurice dreaded discovering what Nerylise found of Kelman Forzen. He wasn't dead, or her declaration would have sounded by now, but he knew that the state of Votus reflected its ruler. Nerylise's voice sounded from deeper in the room, muffled and indecipherable. But Maurice heard a stern edge to her tone that was unlike the Aeromancer's usual manner of speaking. Harsh, grasping wheezes sounded from a male recipient. Nerylise shouted after a 15-minute exchange.
"You may enter, Light Maurice, but mind your step and cover your mouth and nose. The air is not safe."
Maurice entered, wading through rancid heaps of clutter that came up to his knees. He didn't know what he pushed his legs against, and he didn't dare look down to find out. He kept the sleeves of his robe pulled tight over his nose and mouth. The first room Maurice entered was a sitting den. At least, that's what he thought it was supposed to be. The current sphere cast its glow from high in an archway leading to the bedchamber. On the floor against the right wall, Nerylise knelt over a figure. His condition was frightful enough to draw attention away from the once lavish sleeping environment. His back and head were against the wall, with his silk trouser-clad legs stretched out in the filth. His glazed eyes were unblinking in a face so sunken and shallow that it was little better than a skull. His matted, sandy Vodesian hair was thin and stringy.
"Several things you must learn from this, Light Maurice."
Nerylise spoke without looking away from the emaciated king. She pressed her hand against his forehead and the back of his neck.
"No slave can truly break their chains without the will to return to freedom. We cannot aid them without getting their consent for freedom first. When one exists in a cage of any kind for long enough, often the first steps in the unknown are filled with fear and pain. They seek to return to their cage, no matter that it's a cold death that awaits them within."
Nerylise's hand shed a light that pulsed yellow and blue as the endless current came in stronger waves to her.
"I gained His Majesty's permission to set him free long enough to attend the summit. I will also restore a portion of his vitality and strength, enough that he may stand with his fellow kings and queens. From then on, he may either return to his poison and renounce the throne for all future Forzens, or he can choose to free himself and begin restoration for himself and his people. They need a ruler who willingly entwines their well-being with the throne for the better."
Nerylise continued in silence for a long while, her forehead beaded with sweat as the healing light soaked into the king's body. The Aeromancer shook her head in dismay.
"His body is so depleted and so poisoned. At present, His Majesty had a week or two at the most. That is, before his heart and brain would still into silence. His blood is so thin. His muscles are weak, his bones are frail. His eyes have not seen daylight in months. So we dare not open the drapes yet. Fates! This is no usual poppy concoction if I am correct. Narrowly spared a glance for a fist-sized heap of powder. His father and grandfather likely purchased a mix that was much more common. His Majesty likely took in more of the same for years. But something is unusually strong with this mixture. I can see it in the effects it holds for the air. I wonder how many citizens are ingesting this blend. Do you understand the spell shape at hand, Light Maurice?
Maurice nodded as she looked at him. His voice sounded comical through his sleeve.
The blue light pushes cleansing waves to rid him of the poison, while the yellow light introduces needed components, as well as bolstering muscles, bones, and blood.
Nerylise nodded.
Very keen observation, Light Maurice. I do not yet know who is to aid me in the restoration of Vodus. Maybe you, maybe another. This spell shape needs to be a common and spreading practice.
Maurice nodded his understanding. He was not unfamiliar with the infusing of cleansing light spell shapes. He applied many such spell shapes to many starving refugees after the Battle of Borkay. Nerylise performed a spell shape that was different from his, a little slower, but her aeromancy allowed a more gradual infusion of earth elements, body warmth, and hydration. Its air focus was meant to help clear the mind of the fog and its craving for more. But coupled with Kelman Forzen's extreme condition, the restoration of his body would take hours. This did not dishearten Nerylise.
You are a quick learner, Light Maurice. You may depart into the city and tend to your task.
Maurice inclined his head in a slight bow.
Thank you, Light Nerylise. I will be ceaseless.
Maurice spent the rest of the cool, cloudless day walking in the streets of Serral. He followed the sound of unsupervised groups of children playing in the alleys and byways. There were not horses and carriages for fear. Adults were a scarce presence at best. The only thing that could hurt the barefoot children of Vodus was the long, thorny weeds and the deep, wide gouges in the cracked cobbles. Maurice found more children that were almost as sick and weak as the boy he healed before. He located 6 such children within 3 hours of leaving the palace. He measured out his energies careful and slow. He would have to pace himself if he were to heal and guide so many. His magic probed far into the ground, seeking for freshwater wells and edible plants. There wasn't much to find, and it was farther away from the city where it could not be crushed or buried underfoot. The children were the same age as Maurice, if not several years younger. As weak as they were, they possessed keen senses which made it difficult to conceal his efforts and blend in among them. He kept the hood of his gray robe up, hiding his platinum hair and shadowing his fair Pirali skin. Maurice halted at mid-afternoon to rest and allow the endless current to rejuvenate him. By then, more than a dozen children were on their feet and following an alien impulse to mushrooms, berries, and water. He pondered the lives of these children led. Though carefree, their hunger and thirst created a war for them to survive. The concept wasn't so strange to Maurice. Surviving the hardships heaped upon children by adults was a strong truth in the invasion. As far as being carefree, it made Maurice remember the children he was acquainted with before joining the Order. He had lived with a band of nomadic artists and performers in those days. He didn't remember how he became part of their brood, except that his mother and father were killed by northern bandits, and the caravan had taken him in. But Maurice was an oddity among the children. Years later, he guessed that this was why he felt a special kinship with Rylan. He joined in their playing from time to time, but he was always inclined to watch. He would observe for possible dangers and steer the unsuspecting children away from them. This took a lot of effort at first. Maurice would see the precipice of a rocky ravine, and he would run to pull them away. In time, Maurice only had to think of what would save these children,
and they would unknowingly move to his wishes. Everything changed when a small girl screamed night after night from in the dark of a covered wagon. Maurice was only 5, but the girl's screams caused a tear of pity from him every night. So one day, under a bright noon sun on an open plain of long green grasses, Maurice held out his hand palms up and closed his fist. At the time, Maurice could not say what compelled him to do this. An undeniable urge screamed from obedience from deep within his brain and bowels. For the rest of the day, Maurice would not open his fist. So that night, as he slept on the flat grasses away from a fire in dark cold, the girl's scream sounded again and he rose to his feet. Maurice followed the sound of the cries to the wagon and climbed in slow, careful to leave out the use of his closed hand. Her mother and father slept beyond a wooden partition. He found the tiny girl sitting up, covering her eyes as she screamed. Maurice put a comforting arm around her shoulders. "Are you afraid of the night?" Maurice asked in a gentle coo. The girl's sobs calmed at his presence and she nodded. Monsters in the dark." Maurice now spoke and moved on impulse and instincts that were way beyond his young mind to comprehend. "Do the monsters come in the day?" The girl shook her head. "They hate the light?" She nodded. Maurice smiled boldly. "Then you are lucky. I asked the sun if I could borrow a piece of it, and it said yes." Maurice opened his palm, but even he was not prepared for what came next. The light that flared from his now open hand was warm, soothing, and blindingly bright. It filled the wagon and spilled far beyond, waking up tens of families in the caravan. There was a furtive murmur of voices as men and women shielded their sleepy eyes with their hands and arms. The noon light broke the darkness as a piece of day intruding on the night. The next day, the caravans made a long trek south to Catan. The artists were surprised to find several Ard Solaces waiting outside the front gate of the Zenith Citadel. They were eager to receive Maurice. Maurice would not let his weary legs drag as he walked in front of the two-legged bull. The sun was low in the west, casting an orange glow above the adobe walls. Narrated was waiting outside the entry. Looking at her, Maurice realized neither of them would permit signs of their fatigue to show. They forced their eyes to remain wide and alert, and their mouths closed. They both looked at the inn spilling in its dim lantern light, and their shoulders slumped ever so slightly in hesitation. They were not particularly eager to sleep in a nearly derelict inn. "Some places, we might pay for lodging with an exchange of services," Narrated commented without looking away from the inn. "But if we improve one location here, then we have to remain and defend it against new vandalism." Narrated reached into her robe and retrieved a small leather coin purse that chimed with monetary promise. 2 rooms, and ward them both wind barrier spell shapes," Narrated instructed before turning away. "Get some rest. I will be a few more hours with His Majesty." Maurice looked up at the broadened windows at the cracked walls. At least his life had prepared him to sleep anywhere. Chapter 9. "Red brick," Borvis argued, holding his claim adamantly. Ryland shook his head. "You'll draw in all manners of spiders." "I came from a farming nation like Ryland. Trust me, spiders are good. They eat locusts and pests." "Just because you hail from a farming nation like Borvis does not mean that you know the farms. The red brick will bring the spiders out into the fields and straight to the homes. They will be lazy, and they will bite any child who draws too close. Dark granite." "That's so gloomy," Boris whined. "It makes most foreigners believe they've traveled too far east into Catan Shah." Ryland waved his arms at the endless plains around him, before Borcray, and gestured to the cloudless sky. "Do you see the hills leading to the rocky cliffs? Is there a continual blanket of overcast clouds? Borvis pointed a recriminating finger.
That is simply rude, like Ryland, to care. You refute the aesthetic wisdom of our departed mentors. Do you wish to tell me that you have the fashion sense of a drunken Catani in Parole Glay?
Leave it to a baron's son to exaggerate and twist words to greater offense than was intended. Ryland drawled, rolling his bright blue eyes.
Leave it to a Malcanorian to defend a gloomy and bleak sense of tradition.
Borvis jammed a finger at Ryland's chest. Ryland leaned forward and murmured in barely more than a whisper. Do you think they hurt us? Borvis winked as he held his applewood staff.
I give them 5 minutes.
Can we at least agree on orchids and irises? Ryland shouted pleadingly.
They're so frail, Borvis moaned. Everyone in Stratia knows that roses are the true decorative trend. A man can win a woman's heart with more ease if roses are within reach.
Not in Malcanor. We have all seen so many roses that their smell has become like horse dung, and the sight of them hurts our eyes.
What are you two lads on about?
Came the demand of a middle-aged man. He was average size with the sun-bleached hair and skin known for Vodesians. His crude brown clothes were ripped in places, and he had a cutlass and dagger sheathed at the hip of his belted tunic. His expression was dull, and his conical brown cloth cap only added to the humorous effect.
Do you mind? Boris appealed irritably. We are trying to discuss properly redecorating the city behind you.
Only as much as any man may discuss anything with a weasel-faced, beak-nosed Tyrillian, Ryland grumbled. Borvis turned and gasped.
How dare you! I'll have you know that this nose is a charming extension of a handsome continent. It reaches out with the force of my vast charisma.
The older man cleared his throat loudly. Why are you still here? Ryland demanded as he leaned impatiently against his emerald staff. No one has wanted to live in Borcray for 2 years. There is nothing to prevent you from returning to Vodus. Go on now. Shoot! Though Aimrine was miles away helping Ishel and Baron Zenrik Len with preparations for the summit and the wedding, he felt her giggle with unrestrained amusement. She could not catch her breath.
You lads are trespassing on our lands,
the man informed warningly. Ryland turned to Borvis. Did your nose know that there is more than one man in Borcray?
Of course not. My nose is not omniscient.
Their stench is thick and foul, like Borvis. What use is such pronounced nostrils if you can't smell something so obvious?
More use than a dark sense of Malcanor propriety.
You lads can leave your valuables, including that shiny stick. And we'll let you leave alive.
Ryland looked at the thief, then at Borvis. This man wants my staff. Borvis shook his head.
I can't see why he would want anything from you. No one knows where it's been,
says the man from the nation with the red brick palace.
Beg your pardon.
His Majesty resides in a rose marbled palace. Ryland nodded. That explains your detestable fascination with stinkweed. The thief pressed 2 fingers to his lips and produced a shrill, loud whistle. From the concealment of the long grasses, more than 30 men burst into view surrounding the 2 Soluses. They were dressed in a similar fashion as the first man, varying in age, size, and weaponry. Ryland saw that more than 2 of them had acquired Kassaran armbucklers and curved longswords. Ryland contained the memories that threatened to spill forward at the sight of the crimson armament. He had agreed with Borvis to maintain an appearance, even if it was awkward for him to project.
Do you see? These men are clearly tasteful admirers of roses.
And you offended them, like Ryland. Pah! Such discussions are better had between like-minded fools. With that observation in mock disgust, Ryland shaped a fold step that placed him outside the gates of Porcray. A murmur of consternation followed Ryland's departure from the ambush.
"Where did the Malkorian go?"
the first thief shouted, looking about with disbelief.
"You are sorcerers?"
Borvis winked as he cleared his mind and allowed a moderate wave of endless current to flow into him. "And I'll wager these people elected you as their leader, because you must be the quickest wit among them." The thief leader looked about to say something in his defense, but Borvis was already on the move. He placed his palms against the end of his apple staff and shortened the length that his hands came together. Borvis whistled a cheery tune. A man with an oversized scimitar rushed Borvis with a cleaving slash for his throat. He ducked underneath the blade and came face to face with the attacker, his hands cupped before his mouth. Borvis opened his hands and blew in a burst. There was no trace of the staff. He twirled his hands and a polished steel ball appeared above his palm. He stepped back, juggling the fist-sized ball while he whistled. He blew a higher note in his tune while one hand slipped behind his back. Another steel ball popped high behind Borvis, leaping to join the first ball in the circular orbit. Two more thieves rushed at him, attempting to sever his head and disembowel him with broadswords. The orbit of the balls blocked the strikes and hard impacts before smashing into their jaws and temples. Borvis leapt high over a war mace sweeping at his legs. While he was in the air, he shaped two more steel balls that popped into orbit from underneath his legs. The combined spheres created a continual blur of motion. He landed and kicked his legs up, one after another, and he caught the balls underneath his legs while they continued to fly. They flew high from behind his back as well. The entire spell shape was partially inspired when he watched some of Light Baron's displays for younger children, as he juggled spheres of large blue fires. The thieves began to understand what Borvis was about, and 7 more men rushed at him in unison. His concentration tightened further as 4 more polished spheres appeared in his hands. The heightened focus of each ball as it whirled about him became an all-encompassing awareness that drank in the efforts of himself and his attackers. Borvis swerved and ducked underneath weapon strikes, moving with the grace of a dancer. The blurring clouds of shining metal obliterated weapon shafts and shattered blades. The endless current propelled his arms and legs and pushed the metal balls with more force, causing crushing impacts. All the while, Borvis continued whistling his tune, pushing the endless current in a whirlwind all around him. His limbs twisted and undulated with the pitch and cadence of his notes. This was the spell shape the Polymancers developed and perfected during the war with the Cassarans. He named it the Juggler's Melody. Light Baron, various taverns, and festivals all had a hand in inspiring its creation. Borvis spared a thought for the irony of the moment. More than 2 years ago, this spell shape was perfected not half a mile from where he fought now. At the time, he crushed the skulls of 2 Havoc Elite, broke the legs of 5 soldiers, and reduced a pair of massive ballistas into shards of flying wood and metal. The reminiscence caused Borvis to fail to anticipate a sword thrust aimed at his back. He heard the grinding of breaking metal as the blade met an impassable barrier. Borvis turned and pummeled the thief up in the air with 5 upward slamming spheres against his ribs. Borvis rolled his brown eyes. There was an agreement with Ryland that Borvis would handle evicting the thieves. He would have to speak with the Chronomancer about minding his task. The militia heads that the Cassarans mounted on poles at the gates of Porcray 2 years ago had been in place for far too long already. These thieves were slow and mostly uncoordinated. Borvis surmised that their weapons really did speak volumes about them. They were armed with battlefield discards, the rust and dents obvious even without seeing them through the endless currents. Half of these fighters were drunk with a cheap, heavy ale that caused Borvis to wince with the distaste at the reek. He could rule out the possibility that their presence in any tasteful establishment. "My, you boys will drink any swine swill they put in front of you," Borvis observed playfully as he shattered the forearms of a man with a mace twice beyond his limit. The weapon fell to the ground with a loud thud. "Do you even bother to ask what is in it? It smells dreadful."
You'll never charm the ladies drinking that filth.
A few of the men howled with increased fury. They charged at Borvis with thoughtless, raging attacks. They were easier for Borvis to handle than the previous efforts. Even without Ryland's stasis cloak, he was certain he would have these men unconscious, in chains, and ready to deliver to Marcellus de Care as agreed upon. 5 of the men had their presence of mind to see that there was no way for them to win. Borvis was toying with all of them. His experience in war and his magic made this a dance and a time for him to play. Those 5 men fled, while 24 men were crumpled on the ground. Borvis made no move to chase them as they fled. Ryland could gather them up later. They would stand for their crimes by the end of 3 days. Borvis ducked underneath the last rusty Kassaran sword. One steel ball cracked against the bottom of the thief's chin with a loud crunch. Borvis decreased the flow of the endless current to lessen the impact. The thief would live, though with a sore jaw and a couple less teeth. He then landed on his back. There was a rustle from above, and Borvis crouched, prepared to defend himself. Ryland jumped down, landing on his feet. The maneuver from high in the trees was so graceful that Borvis wondered where he had learned such a thing. You allowed 5 of them to flee. Ryland's accusation was flat-toned. Borvis shrugged his shoulders. You can catch them later. We need to get these thieves back to Palanza. We need to get back here quickly so we can make these walls and barracks ready for the garrison. Are you certain you wish to see so much, Light Borvis? Ryland's question was tentative. You do have a wedding to attend. Borvis didn't need the reminder as much as Ryland believed. Isha was right to assign him to a help Ryland, though he was reluctant to admit it when she did. There was only 2 other places Borvis could be at this moment. He could be at the Archlight compound, where dozens of sorcerers would direct their glares and accusations because he would not be at the second option. He could be at his father's estate in Murwald. If he were at his birth home, he would be in a stuffy, overcrowded fitting room. He would have a dozen tailors groping at him in a way he wished reserved for his fiancée, Ishel. Ishel herself would be a tightly wound ball of highly explosive nerves, or her more fearless demeanor would reign in everyone present. While Borvis was uneasy around Ryland, wary of his dangerous power and spontaneous reactions, he was still a neutral-natured good man. This made Ryland's presence more palpable than Borvis's other options. I need no reminders, Light Ryland. I have been a light of the council for some time now. Borvis didn't mean for his tone to be so abrasive. He funneled his irritation into transmuting the weapon pieces into binding chains as he gathered up the thieves. Ball Cray is a lot of work, Light Ryland. Borvis breathed, easing his aggression. Even together, I believe we need more than a week to make it ready for living. In your condition, if I leave you alone, I may return to find you on the ground. Do you believe Light Ishel would ever let me rest with that crime? Ryland nodded. Then save your energies. After we gather them, I can place them in a stasis cloak. Borvis momentarily restrained the tirade he held at the mention of one of Ryland's signature spell shapes. He really wanted to address the use of the protective stasis sphere on his back earlier. What do you have in mind? I will link my will with yours. Your polymancy is swift and smooth, much better than my own. Borvis raised his eyebrow. Just as in the rebuilding of your homes in Palanza's outer city. Will you be well with this? Fate's light, Borvis. Ryland rolled his eyes. I passed the trial and helped you with more conclusions to New Catan. My pain has become more aligned with the limits of my will. You do not need to approach me with the hands of a coddling nursemaid. Borvis threw up his hands in defeat as he turned to drag the other thieves closer together. He had only gathered 5 more men in the time he spoke with Ryland. He fought down a weary groan at the prospect of dragging 17 heavy men to one spot. But he didn't need to concern himself. Ryland's face was tight with focus and annoyance as he disappeared and reappeared in rapid blinks, taking unconscious men with him. Each motion was a burst of current that shoved against Borvis's inner being.
Such bursts of power would only ever be considered small by Rylan or Ishel. Rylan gathered 10 more of the thieves in the time it took Borvis to drag 2.
Who, Borvis wheezed, are you performing for?
Rylan shrugged. You need to get back to your bride, and the people of Borcray need strong walls and a garrison of Phoenix Legionnaires to keep them safe here. Rylan stepped twice more and looked up at the sky. We can at least give them thicker walls, watchtowers, and a barracks all on the west. Borvis didn't respond, but he thought Rylan was wrong. While he claimed he remained here because he was unsure of the extent of the healing he had already undergone, his observations were quite the opposite. The tortures and solaces that rebuilt Palantir varied in strength and skill, and united in groups of 5 or 10. Borvis knew Rylan was using their example as a template for his own abilities, and they needed months to complete the reconstruction. Borvis couldn't be certain how much power Rylan regained since the wound he had sustained at the hands of Zine and Roll. He had witnessed his frightening abilities in the Battle of Thriwald firsthand. Borvis watched Rylan with an objective gaze over the last 2 years. He had to, as he worked so close with Rylan to build a whole new city. Even without his dust mimics to aid him, Rylan's simulacrum clones that functioned to a lesser capacity, he could aid any polymancer to construct a 2-story home in half their usual time. The amount of time was decreased more by the day. Rylan gathered a potent wave of endless current, tinted with the strange tension that came with his chronomancy. He traced green energies into numbers. Borvis watched the mathematics in sleepy boredom. There was a faint green shimmer that appeared briefly around the gathering of thieves. Borvis sighed.
Like Rylan, try to view this from my eyes.
Rylan's voice was tight with restraint as he responded. I know how it all appears, like Borvis. A Phoenix Legionnaire soldier returns home without an arm. He loses a portion of his ability to work. If he has loved ones, he cannot embrace them as completely as he wishes. But this is not the way of things for me, Light Borvis.
I know this, but that isn't all, Light Rylan. I believe it is time to be more forthcoming.
Borvis took a deep breath, gathering himself for what needed to be said.
So many people claim it was you they saw avenging Stratia's dead and wiping away the Kasarins. Far too many to ignore. Like Ishel would never believe it's you, of course, but I must look from a perspective I am familiar with. You are a good man, and I know you mean well, but destruction tends to swirl about you. It has from the very beginning. I don't know if it was you in the eclipse. I only have the word of frightened men and women in total darkness. That's hardly condemning.
You believe you may be contending with a rogue ballista, Rylan finished for him. It was a shortening of a long-winded thought, but Borvis nodded. It felt good to voice a concern shared by so many. It was honest and relieving, and Borvis was grateful to Ishel for insisting that he accompany Rylan to Borcray. They walked the crude, dusty road to Borcray under a bright sun, and Borvis smiled with a hint of amusement. Rylan did, after all, agree to a theatrical faked argument and allow Borvis an even greater display of theatrics at odds with the Chronomancer's known selfless and helpful nature. It made for a fine day before marriage.
Chapter 10. As exhausted as Ishel felt, she could not find sleep easily. It was partially nerves and the unusual sleeping environment. It was a long and chaotic week as the rulers trickled into the city of Merwald. The summit would occur in 3 days, and many of the baronies and duchesses were already trying to prepare for changes in policy that they could only theorize on. Ishel stood at the tall window, overlooking the now dark shapes of the squat homes of Merwald. She inhaled the earthy autumn air of Terrell, reminded of the smell of rich soils and planted things she was so familiar with. The smells of the field of the outer city were not so different from here. It formed a nostalgic ache in her. These days were not so simple as then. A cool night breeze blew in the open window. Her bed shifted and the curtains swirled in unified tandem with the gust. Isha looked back at the wide bedchamber with its four-posted red oak bed, thrice as large as anything she'd ever slept in. She could not imagine how anyone thought she could find sleep in anywhere so soft and massive. After another day of ladies fussing over her and touching her, Isha still felt awkward and a little embarrassed. With Imreen to care present, spearheading all the wedding arrangements, she could not so much as object. She worked well within the limits of the Len family treasury, as well as the Tecares, to fund a ceremony, feast, and celebration larger than any Ishel could have imagined. Imreen directed everything from tailors to street decorators with a precision that Ishel found unnerving and uncharacteristic of the healer and fighter. Was she truly so knowledgeable about silks and frills? But Ishel's restlessness was elevated by something much stronger. There was an insistent tug on her mind, a pull from so deep within that she could not say where in her body it would be. She grappled with it as she watched a glittering canvas of moonless night and the black shapes beneath. What should she do? Imreen slept in an adjoining bedchamber, and Taranin, Pora, Orissa, and Baron Darren slept in adjacent chambers. Cerintha Len, Ishel's soon-to-be mother-in-law, partitioned an entire wing of the estate for noblewomen and sorceresses to stay. Ishel understood the tradition, and she was honored by it. But it felt so uneasy. She spent her childhood raised by a blacksmith, often playing with village boys. Yes, she was a girl with habits and preferences that were clearly feminine, but she believed she had always smoothly blended in with the boys. As an evoker, the focus and study Ishel applied to mastering the elements forced her to regularly forget about trivial matters. That included innate natures that separated men and women. Yet, all she could do for the past week was tolerate the uncomfortable sensations that came from being a bride. The fawning and fondling made her cheeks flush hot. Fitting into one dress after another felt dainty and silly. Many of the dresses were so thick and puffy that they caused her to sweat profusely. All the planning was far more stressful as it coupled with the drafts of treaties and bargains she would propose at the summit. Ishel snorted with ironic amusement. Did she not give Imreen a much less agonizing wedding than this? She would have to plan a harmless prank for Imreen's future. The pull in Ishel's being became more insistent without growing painful. While it refused to cause her any anguish, it would not be ignored. Very well, I feel it. But what would you have of me? Ishel murmured to no one. Ishel closed her eyes. Another cool breeze blew in through the windows, washing over her. She let go of her stresses and worries one by one, letting the tension drift away from her muscles, leaving only relaxed calm. The pull was like the endless current. Ishel believed as she meld-walked, following only the pulling sensations, she could find its meaning. She surrendered herself to the ocean of vibrations and energy, and let herself be led with closed and trusting eyes. When she halted, she was greeted with the reek of rust and dry dust, among other smells with less strength. But she knew where she stood even before she opened her eyes. A single point of white light cast its pressure against her closed eyelids. The sound of calm and even breathing was especially loud in the empty and claustrophobic hall. Ishel opened her eyes. Moral stood in a maroon bedrobe and a wool nightcap. A current sphere floated above his right hand. His face was tired and patient as he waited for her to speak first. The hall and the dormant giants were part of the level of the citadel called the Ward, a place of dark cells and magical caretakers. Moral discovered much about the secret level of the former home of the Order. A lot of information was obtained in the vault behind him after it was unsealed 2 years ago. But there were still a lot of secrets he did not have. There was a door in the vault that remained closed, even to him. You were drawn here, Light Moral? Though Ishel asked, her presence was not a complete surprise to her. Something felt right that he should be here as well. Even before I read the histories inside, we discovered that the vault calls to one selected light when they are ready. Moral turned and placed a hand on the wall, projecting his will into the stone. The wall shimmered, like ripples on the surface of a pond before it wavered and vanished. A tall white chamber filled with a burst of light from candles set all around the room beyond. Isha looked inside well before following Moral. There were tall shelves filled tight with books. A podium sat in the center of the room with a book and ink bottle set on top. There were tall glass cases containing an array of objects. She felt the hum of the endless current from each case as it buzzed and pulsed against her skin. Isha followed Moral and watched with piercing intent as she crossed into the vault. She was exposed and vulnerable. The feeling made her wish she had time to dress beforehand. She should present herself as a sorceress before such a judging pressure. Did Moral feel naked as well? I am honestly relieved this day should come so soon. Moral smiled with a nervous chuckle. There is so much confusion and things I wish I never knew. It may be more so with you. Isha was a little confused herself. With me? The vault called us here, Lad Isha. If you would follow a little further, you will learn why. Isha followed, pausing only before a glass case containing an ornate silver baton with cut rubies in both ends. She read the golden placard set in the wooden stand. Storm Harvest, Narrated Inquiry, AD 1502. Moral turned to look back at Isha. Before his radiance died, these artifacts were brought above to introduce the torches deep in their training. The last king of Narrated wielded Storm Harvest to gather weather catastrophes to direct against those he viewed as his enemies, often his own people. Isha turned from the case and followed Moral to the other side of the room. The dusty white wall was etched with a thick, giant sunburst. A variety of sigils and symbols filled and surrounded the image. Isha stared at the wall in fascination. Her mind lulled in a sleepy fixation on every curve and line chiseled into the white marble. Without a thought, her right arm lifted and her palm rested on the cold stone. Every dark etching filled and flared with blinding white light. Isha wanted to blink, to shield her eyes, but her trance would allow no movement. The light seeping out, reaching for every corner and crevice in the wall. It wrapped each giant block in its brilliant embrace. There was a sudden blast of wind and a final flare of light, and the wall was gone. Moral spoke into the silence that ensued. There was a point even I could not cross. The vault knew I led, but I am not the Grand Illumination. I was only permitted to see part of the vault. Like Martin and Dalek, was never drawn to the vault. His role was not acknowledged. Moral's meaning descended on Isha then. The fact that it took her so long to comprehend it only reinforced her doubts that he would be right. I am no odd solace like Moral. I have only been a solace for 2 years, and a light of the Order for 6. I have so much to learn. Suddenly, I am not qualified. Moral's deflection was patient. That is not relevant here. The vault decides who is to be Grand Illumination and when. I was called to relinquish the vault to you, Your Radiance. As Moral spoke to the title to her, Isha's knees buckled, and she was hit with a wave of dizziness. Moral continued to lock his intense gaze on Isha. She realized he would not look at the contents of the newly opened portion of the vault. The light that dissolved the wall spread into a thick band that lined the wall over their heads. When Isha saw the contents of the sealed room, she wished she was forced into Moral's ignorance. Her bones chilled, and a hollow pressure forced itself into her abdomen. She understood in that moment the full weight of the burden of the Grand Illumination. As part of the Council of Solace, Isha was aware of the discoveries that were revealed in the vault so far. When Moral was not instructing a new generation of archivists, he was poring over and cataloging every bit of information he found here. With the events of the eclipse and the Battle of Catan, the Council believed it was time to share the discoveries with historians all over Stratia. It was clear that the dark stories of 2 millennia ago were not the final tale of the Void Hands. But here, the full scope of everything known to the Order was laid bare. There was armor stands covered with black robes, tunics, pants, gloves, and boots that were commonly worn by Void Hands.
The faceless black stands made it appear that the dreaded mythic figure stood there. Ishel felt her heart quicken with fear. There were glass jars filled with amber fluid, suspending eyes and claws that were too large to belong to any resident of Provis. There were stacks of books, sealed cases of glass holding daggers and artifacts made of bone and gold. Most chilling of all were the amulets suspended from gold chains. They had black gems as big as her thumb contained within bars of gold. Against Ishel's better judgment, she looked closer at one of the gems, holding it closer in her hand. The instant she touched the gem, a man's agonized pleading cries invaded her brain. Images of a naked, emaciated shape filled the inside of her mind. He had no flesh. He was a green, luminescent figure. His eyes were wide with horror as he beat his fists against the cramped, black walls around him. Ishel gasped, letting go of the gem and stumbling backwards to trip and fall on her backside. "Fates blight my entire being," Ishel swore in a whisper. "The soul of a man is trapped in there. I would not know, your radiance." Moral maintained a still and rigid posture, facing away from the dark secrets. "I have never been permitted to see it. The rod of binding has been used to retain its secrecy from one grand illumination to the next." Ishel watched as Moral clenched trembling, white-knuckled fists at his sides. She understood the crossroad that was before her. She could do as her predecessor did, safeguard the secrets from all Stratia and reseal the wall. Or she could gain and share the knowledge that was kept here. Ishel only believed in one of these choices. The ignorance of the truth had already exacted a steep price in pain and loss from everyone. But if she simply heaped all these findings on historians all at once, the ancient mistrust would rise, alienating the order from the rest of Stratia. The people would better understand the 2,000 years of secrecy if they were given time to absorb the truth. "Light Moral, I hereby dissolve the solitary guardianship of the Vault of the Grand Illumination." Moral looked down at Ishel, and there was a sad, frightened plea in his eye. "While I crave the chance to acquire new knowledge, I must beg you not to ask this of me, your radiance. Sleep was difficult for months after the eclipse. I saw things in the dark that no mortal was meant to see." Ishel wrapped her hand around his tight fist, looking up at the haunted Chronomancer with sympathy. "We all hurt knowing that what you had to suffer from witnessing that day. It fills me with pain that you screamed in terror for so many nights. Your patience, wisdom, and thirst for knowledge has always been a strength we rely on. I need you to see this as I do. The Void Hands have long exploited our ignorance to achieve consecutive victories over us. Consider, Light Moral, if you had already faced such truth for years beforehand, would anything of the eclipse have left you in such crippling fear?" Moral looked down at Ishel expressionless as he pondered her words. Then he smiled and chuckled. "Despite your new role, it is odd to have my morale boosted by such a young woman." Ishel's smile was mirthful as she shrugged. "I am marrying Light Bovis then, and I have advised my best friend Light Rylan for years. I should hope that I have acquired enough grains of wisdom to pass to you as well." Moral took a deep breath and then turned to face his fears. Ishel stood up and looked at the vault and its secrets. Moral sighed. "We have much to learn, your radiance." Chapter 11. Borvis Len stood at the far end of a narrow crimson rug that was laid out on the Merwall street before him. He was not dressed as a soulless or polymancer now. He wore yellow and black cavalier from head to toe. His breeches, cuffed boots, shoulder cape, and leather-brimmed hat were all black. His shirt with flared sleeves, cuffed at the wrist, and a feather wren in his hat were bright yellow. There were hundreds of people gathered silently at the roads before the Len estate. They were clustered in the most formal clothes, bunched to either side of the carpet path. Beside Borvis, only a head shorter than himself, his father stood, patiently staring ahead. Zenrik Len was dressed similarly to Borvis, though without the cape and hat. His dark brown hair was marked with wide strands of gray,
and his wide, bearded face was less comical, with only a smaller nose. But his brown eyes were narrow, and prone to fits of blinking. He held a long, unlit silver torch. It was many years since Borvis last wore the formal wear of the noble house. The loose and unremarkable clothing of the order was as comfortable as a second skin. With the sun beaming down from a cloudless noon sky, he was grateful that the woman who arranged this ceremony selected mid-autumn. He would need the endless current or several cloth rags if they chose a warmer time of year. But a warmth did rise in the back of his neck. Borvis was a mess of nerves. He loved Isha with every drop of blood in his veins. As much as he boasted exploits in wooing, he could not fathom any woman being as close a match to her. But that was what wound Borvis up the most. Isha was not only beautiful, but she was also practical, caring, and easily the strongest woman he had ever met. The man who would be her husband should be able to keep stride with these shining attributes. Could Borvis do that? Could he be that man?
Calm yourself, boy, Zenrik muttered through the corner of his mouth. I can see your hand tremble.
Borvis looked to his father. Zenrik was a baron who led Merwal without hesitation of any kind. Borvis had only ever witnessed his father fail a treasury plan twice, and his wife was there to plan a recovery as soon as they losses occurred.
Am I enough, father?
Zernik sighed.
I can give you my faith in you, and I always will. But what I believe will not be as potent as what you are brave enough to do. You cannot know what will come of the path in life before you. But the only certainty that you will not be enough is if you do not walk the path at all.
It was a simple answer, but it was enough to calm Borvis. The short, red-haired figure of Talek Senis, king of Terrell, walked into view at the other end of the carpet. He wore a white tunic trimmed with gold and brown pants and brown leather boots. His bright red beard was trimmed short. Behind Talek, before the gates of the estate, there was a tall bronze post, widening at the top to create a giant bowl. It was filled with pitch, tar, oil, and coal. Talek shouted,
The groom may approach.
Borvis and Zernik began a measured practice walk along the narrow carpet. This walk was meant to symbolize his solitary journey in life, guided only by those who came before. Ahead, just before a widening in the carpet, the red fabric branched off to another narrow path. Zenrik and Borvis halted at this convergence. The pause represented the uncertainty in a man's life before his path broadened without a guide. Several minutes passed in contemplative silence before Talek's shouting declaration came.
The bride may approach.
Borvis was not allowed to look north along Ishel's path. The coming together of the bride and groom was considered an unforeseen series of events and the lives that came before. He waited anxiously. When Ernik and Ishel came to the converging, Borvis fought to keep himself from gaping. He ignored the fact that the bear-like shape of Palanzer's favorite blacksmith was dressed in a velvet tunic and breeches. That had to be polymancy. No combination of tailors could make formal attire that large. But Isha was so stunningly beautiful that Borvis failed to notice the pause in his breathing. She wore a pale lavender gown, belted at the hips with a thin silver cord. She wore a long violet silk overcoat with widely flared sleeves. Her sandy-colored hair rested above a silver ring circlet in a round braid, leaving much to descend below her shoulders. The smell of lilacs and honeysuckle faintly filled the air around her. Ernik and Zenrik forced their children to face them one more time. It was the final piece of wisdom and encouragement before the bride and groom continued together.
You are my son, Borvis, and that is why I believe you will be enough.
Zenrik wrapped Borvis in a tight embrace that he returned while fighting tears.
You have much more to you than I ever did. If what I am was enough to keep your mother's heart for so many years, I won't begin to doubt you. But by the fates, give all that charm and wit only to your wife. Don't ever let it wane, lest you allow her to believe she is not worthy of it.
Borvis chuckled. Certainly, father.
Ernick beamed as he looked at Ishel. Every day you live, you fill me with greater pride. I have watched you make all your choices with strength, honor, and conviction. I must believe Solis Kara and your mother watch you, side by side, and celebrate all your triumphs together.
Ishel jumped to embrace the giant shape of her father, as her shoulders bounced with sobs. I love you, you dear old man. Ernick placed her down to stand beside Borvis as she took his hand in her own. Blood thundered loudly in his head as he swallowed his strange anxiety. Fates! She was too beautiful for him to think straight. Ernick stepped in front of them, towering. He held a length of thin gold rope. Ishel raised her own hand, and Borvis's for her father. The blacksmith's giant hand deftly wrapped their wrists and tied them together. Even his gentle voice was a deep boom.
With my blessing, be bound together.
Ernick moved outside of the carpet path while Zenrik stepped before them and offered the silver torch. They accepted with their bound hands.
With my blessing, let your passions bind you together.
Zernik stepped aside as Terranin walked free of the crowd to stand in front of them. She wore a long, plain brown farmer's dress and a silver variation of the Order's gray robe. With a burst of her will, her hand was covered in long tongues of orange fire. She smiled, with a tear in her eye, and her fiery hand reached for the end of the torch. With my blessing, walk forward together, and let your passion for each other light the way. Borvis and Ishel raised the torch high as Terranin melded back into the crowd of people. They walked, in a unified slow pace, careful with their burning torch. Talik waited with his hands clasped behind his back. Rylan and Aimreen Tikar stood foremost to Borvis's left. Aimreen wore a brocaded blue gown, while her husband wore a silver tunic and pants under his enchanted green coat. His emerald displacement staff gleamed in one hand. They were accompanied by the newly gray-robed Maurice and the now nicknamed Black Wind Jorican Baranol. Marcellus and Birol Tikar stood with Malaric Morinroke to the right. It was neither a surprise or disappointment to not find Macelin or a Morlick. Borvis and Ishel reached to the other end of the carpet and stood before Talik Senis. He smiled and spread his arms.
With the passion that binds and guides thee, reach beyond crowns and nations. With love and passion, ignite a blaze and draw the sights of the fates.
Borvis and Ishel thrust the burning end into the wide bowl, and it burst with a towering bonfire.
Before kings, fates, and those who came before, I declare thee Borvis Len and Ishel Len, husband and wife.
Borvis and Ishel released the torch. They turned to each other. Ishel's free hand pulled him close from behind the back of his head. His free hand wrapped around her waist to pull her up from behind. Their mouths locked in a tight, deep kiss. The gathered people of Merwald cheered, but Borvis did not hear them. His mind was locked with single-mindedness on the woman he held and kissed, his wife. His mind replayed all the moments that brought them here now. It was the best moment he, as a man, could ever wish for.